There we go, desktop one. And let's see.
And now participants could add their question in our chat. Then we had time to read it and talk about that.
Great.
Yeah, and feel free to upvote questions too, so that way, if there's a question that multiple people want to ask, then we try to prioritize that and ask that at the end of Tom speaking.
Sounds good. Can you see the slide I've posted?
We see
your
email.
Screen, but not slides.
Okay. That's because PowerPoint put it onto the wrong screen. Hold on.
Yeah.
Let's try once more.
We see your PowerPoint screen. Yes.
Okay, this is not, if I put it in presentation mode, it goes into the other screen. So let me just do it this way because, there we go. That'll have to do.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess to start with, let me start my timer so I don't go on forever. I kind of regretted the title just because trying to pack 30 years into 20 minutes doesn't work very well. But here's the plan I came up with. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about me so you can put my remarks in context. And in thinking about what to talk about, a lot of what I've learned is very dependent on context. And I decided what I'd do is to think about what sort of things do I do that have worked for me over the years and that I don't see a lot of other people doing. And the hope is that some of that might be useful to you, some of it might not, because we're all in different situations. But I'm going to talk about 3 different things that I've done over my career which have worked for me. And I'll start out with specific examples and then try to make them a little bit more general. And we'll see how it works. So first about me, as was mentioned, I retired. Just so you have a sense of who I am, I like to do outdoors things. I read a lot. My 2 big projects are learning to play the piano and learning geology. Moving on to the kind of work I've done, designer covers a lot of ground. And I was originally trained in cognitive psychology, and that kind of expanded into social science. So I started out as kind of a user person, but pretty quickly, since I spent quite a while working at Apple in a group that was a mix of computer scientists and designers, I picked up enough design to be dangerous. I mean, I'm not, I don't have the technique that you get when you go to design school, but I can do well enough to get by. So, in terms of work, basically for the last easily, roughly 30 years or more, my work involves going back and forth between field work and designing things. Ideally, it's nice to do field work first, learn stuff, and then design something. But often it turns out that you end up either designing something because you didn't have time to do the field work, and then ideally studying how it works later. Or occasionally, some of the most interesting studies I've done have involved coming across systems which I've thought, that really shouldn't work. I don't understand why that works, and I want to find out. And so then I study something that's already out there. So anyway, that's kind of what my work is like, going back between watching people and designing stuff. My career has been I sort of started small and got bigger and bigger. I started out for 5 years at a small software startup. It was about 20 people when I joined, and got up to 100 people, and then went down to 30 people and up to 200 and like that, which was an interesting experience. Then I moved on to Apple, which is where I learned almost everything I knew about design. And then I did a bit over 20 years at IBM Research. And the latter part of my career, the last 25 years, I've been remote. And by remote, I don't mean I work from home a couple of weeks. I mean that I was between 1,000 and 1,500 miles away from my workplace. And I would occasionally take trips out and spend time on site, but mostly I was back at my office. And I think that's useful because it made me think a lot about how to get maximum value about the time I spend in the presence of other people and those I work with. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. I could give a whole talk on how to work remotely, but I think everybody is getting that experience these days. Let's see, and just to contextualize things, some key things here are, I've worked at Apple and IBM, which are both very large organizations. And so I'm talking from the context of being in a giant organization. If you're like a consultant or work in a small company, things will differ. I've also worked mostly, certainly in the latter part of my career, on research, which is really different from being, on a product track. But I think there's still a certain amount of commonality. And then, as I said, the remote work is also a very different thing. So, okay, without more ado, let's get to the three things that I hope will be useful. The first practice that I've used from the very beginning of my career are stories and storytelling. Kind of the big aha for me, and I'll spend a bit of time on this because a lot of you are starting out. And I started out actually in graduate school. I went to UC San Diego. I studied cognitive psychology for 5 years. And there I was kind of floundering. I was trying to figure out, what am I good at and what do I like and do they overlap at all? And it was a hard time, but one thing I noticed, so I was in a lab with three professors, and one of them was very striking. He was quite well known at the time, and he's become very famous over the years. It's Don Norman, and I was struck by Don because I noticed he had a different. So I was looking at a lot of people who were researchers or professors, and they would take very small problems and figure out how to sort of divide them up and study them carefully. And Don was very different. An example is, the first thing I remember is he'd gone off on a vacation to Italy. He'd bought an expensive camera to take pictures, and then he got to Italy and he couldn't figure out how to use it. And so he came home and he started complaining. He complained to everyone. He talked about how badly the camera was designed and why couldn't it be like this and why couldn't it be that. And then as he did that, other people started saying, yes, I had an experience like that with my camera, or, oh, you think your camera is bad, you ought to see my car. And what I could see is that Don was breaking things up into little stories that he would tell. They would be entertaining, and they would get other people to talk to him and tell him stories. And I thought, aha, that's something I can do. That's something I realized, yes, I can do that. I don't know about all this other stuff, but I can recognize and pick up stories and tell them. And so just a little example is early on in my career at Apple, we were studying how people organize information on their desktop, and I went around interviewing people, and I kept hearing a version of the same story over and over again, which I came to call the guilt pile story. And the guilt pile story is this, and for those of you who are completely digital and do not use paper, this will seem archaic, but maybe some of you do. But anyway, what I found is everybody had a story that went kind of like this. You get something you want to read, a book, a paper, but you don't have time. And so you set it somewhere over on your desk to get to it later. And then something else comes in. And again, you don't have time and you put it over there and you start building up this pile of things that you really intend to do. And initially it's fine. Yeah, you've got this nice pile. Oh, the really interesting stuff in there. It's great. But then the pile gets higher and higher and you start to feel uncomfortable. And it actually literally starts, becoming a little tottery and dangerous. And so at some point you say, I really have to deal with this because it's about to collapse, and you sort through it and, oh, now I can throw a bunch of stuff away because it's not relevant anymore. And, oh, here's one thing I'll take out to read. And then you feel good. And so that's the guilt pile story. And the thing about the guilt pile story is that it gives you a bit of, it gives a problem everybody faces, all this information you have to deal with, not enough time. And it talks about some of the emotion behind it, that there's this stuff you want, but you get behind, you feel bad, and then you do something and you feel better. And that's kind of the essence of stories. Stories are small things that make a point that both has logic to it, but it also has emotion to it. And so to just expand that out a bit, I use stories throughout my practice of design. So the guilt pile story is just one of, dozens, probably hundreds of stories I've had, and they come and go depending on the project. But as I was saying, a good story has a structure and a resonance to it, and often a kind of emotional logic to it. I like stories because they combine the particular and the emotion with the rational. And as I was saying about Dawn, it's not just about me telling other people's stories. When you tell people stories, they want to tell you stories back, and that gets communication going. And the other nice thing about stories is it's not like you're trying to make this big claim about this is true for everything. They're just stories, right? They're not making a big claim. They're making just little pieces of claims. And so nobody gets too invested in it. Oh, you have a different story that contradicts my story. That's okay. There are lots of stories. And so the takeaway here is that throughout my career, my ears always prick up when I hear somebody tell a story. It might be a good story about how something solved a problem. It might be one of Don Norman's stories about, oh, how horrible this technology is and why couldn't it just be like this and that it would be better. But so that's point number one, practice number one. Practice number two. I call these conversational props. That's a general term, but throughout my career, this was mostly at IBM, but as I came up with design ideas that I was trying to sort of sell to people in the company, I started making little cards that had sketches on them because I was doing stuff with little visualizations, and it's hard to talk about a visualization. You can kind of wave your hand, but that doesn't really do it. You really need to see pictures. And so I ended up with like a whole deck of cards with all my ideas on it, and I'd be talking with people and I could pull out a card and show it to them, and they'd look, and it would change the focus of the conversation from me talking with them to both of us looking at something outside ourselves. And so to generalize this a little bit, I call these cards, they're one instance of what I call a conversational prop. I used cards, but it could be objects, it could be pictures, it could be a book of sketches. But for me, I find it works best when they are not digital, when there's stuff that you can hold and you can pass and you can maybe scribble on them. And they create a focus that's not about you. You're both talking about this third thing, and it should be something that is not this precious thing you've spent hours working on, and it shouldn't be a generic thing. It should be kind of in between, right? Something that you're not afraid to write on, but something that is not just generic either. And sometimes, not all the time, if you have a good conversation, you give it to them as a gift, and maybe, probably they'll throw it away, but maybe it'll sit around on their desk and they'll think back to the conversation a week later or a couple weeks later, or not. But the takeaway here is that I like having tangible things because they really change the nature of a conversation. to go off on a slight tangent, there's a guy, a philosopher by the name of Donald Schoen. He's probably gone by now, but he was at MIT, and he talked about design in a way that really resonated with me. He talked about the process of design as making a representation of the thing you're designing, right? It might be a prototype, it might be a sketch. If you're an architect, it might be a sketch or a blueprint. If you're an industrial designer, it might be a foam core model or a nice 3D model. But what Sean always talked about is that the core of design is you make a representation of something, and once you get it outside of your head, you can sort of have a conversation with it, and the representation will talk back to you. And so this is kind of that idea too, except with these conversational props, we're trying to make things that talk back to both me, but also talk back to whoever I'm talking with. And so we can kind of get this multi-sided dialogue going on with this object that makes it work better. The other thing I'll say about here, and then I'll go on to my last point, but takeaway number 2 here is I've always found radical openness to be the way I want to pursue my design work. That is, if I have ideas, I go around and I tell everybody about them, right? I mean, I've been in situations where there are people who like to, you tell an idea and somebody else says, oh, that's a great idea. And then they make it theirs and they kind of steal it. I don't worry about that so much. Instead, if I have ideas, I talk about them to everyone. And well, the worst that can happen is somebody else takes it and runs with it. But if I've, in the meantime, talked about it to 24 other people, eventually people know, that I had a hand in whatever this person is running with, and there are more ideas than a single person can really develop anyway. So if somebody is actually going to run off with it, well, good, that's great. I mean, there are situations in which it's not great, I get that, but in general, I try to come as close to being perceived as, I guess, a cross between a fanatic or a very passionate person and a bore, because I'll sit anyone down and start talking to them and showing them cards and say, oh, look at this. What do you think about that? And that has always worked for me. Okay, last idea. And then I'll actually wrap up more or less in time. So this one, I came up with the name Strategic Serendipity, which I don't really like that name very much, but this comes in part especially out of my challenge of being a remote person who sometimes very rarely goes back to an office where everybody else is. And the particular practice that I will generalize in a minute, but the thing I did is for a long time, I had an office at IBM, but when I would go back to IBM, which was typically like at the most 1 week a month, but typically it was more like a couple days a month and sometimes a couple days a year, I would almost never work in my office. My office was if I needed to have a private meeting with somebody, but what I really liked to do was find a semi-public place to work. So on the screen here, you're looking at spaces in IBM at the bottom of the screen. I hope you can see it because I can't see what you're seeing of my slides, but you see at the very bottom left, you see a shot of the IBM research building from a distance. And what's important to see here is that the front is all windows. It's this long curve. It's a third of a circle, a third of a mile long. And behind the windows are hallways that run along the entire building. And there are other ways to get around, but almost everyone moves back and forth through those long curved hallways. And so when I went to IBM, I would always sit in the hallways. the hallways were designed so that at the upper left, they had nooks with whiteboards. And the idea was that people could just bump into one another and there'd be a whiteboard and they could collaborate there. And that actually worked sometimes. In the upper right is the IBM Cafeteria, where I would set up shop during non-lunch hours. Again, kind of out near the edge where the windows were, where people walked by. And in the lower right is a shot of the IBM library, which again is up against the windows, and I'd sit there and be visible to anyone who was walking by. And the reason for that is I wanted to be able to bump into people that I would not see in the course of everyday business, right? Because one of the challenges of being remote and having a career is, well, you work with the people you work with, but where does the next thing come from, right? Yeah, your manager might help you, but it's good to make larger connections. And so I had various ways of making connections, but working in public was a way that I would renew those. People would wander by and say, "Oh, Tom, I worked with you 3 years ago, or haven't seen you in 6 years, or whatever." So let's broaden this a little bit. Okay, so there's a famous paper in the social networking field, which has had some critique, but I still like the basic idea. It's called The Strength of Weak Ties. And for our purposes, the basic argument is that if you have a big network of people, the most valuable stuff to you, the stuff that is most valuable to you is likely to come from your weak connections, from people who are not closely connected to you, from people who are in very different contexts, from people who are far away, from people who don't do what you do. Because since they don't share the context, most of what they know is new. A lot of it is irrelevant to you, but there is a little bit that isn't, and that is much more likely to be novel. And so I try to structure my work life, and again, in part because I'm a remote worker, but I try to structure it so that I end up interacting or bumping into people who are very different from me and who I wouldn't normally bump into, right? You can do this. So when I joined IBM, I was hired as a remote worker. And one of the conditions that was imposed on me, which was a really good one, is they said, well, we're going to require you to spend 15% of your time consulting with different groups around research, just to get to know people. And that was great because I got to know people and I would bump into them 10 or 15 or 20 years later, and the people I'd worked with who were, some of them were programmers, or just working in kind of ordinary jobs, some of them became vice presidents, right? Some of them became leaders, some of them were happy programmers. But over time, I developed this very far-flung network. And by being in places where I would just randomly bump into them, like in the cafeteria, I would just renew those little connections. And so, and sometimes somebody says, yeah, I remember you from that project, and we're on this other project now, and we're having this issue. So that kind of thing. I would also, for the same reason, organize interest groups. Like at Apple, I ran a little group that discussed urban design, the design of cities, right? What does that have to do with computers? I can make an argument about how it has to do with, online interaction, but it was more for just fun and connecting with people. I did the same thing. Somebody else started the group, but I enthusiastically joined it. There was a group called People Systems, which for some reason attracted people from all across IBM, not just from research, but from marketing and from, people would call in from the UK and Europe and the Middle East. And so again, I'd rub shoulders with people who are really different from me. So, the lesson here is think strategically about how to maximize your unexpected encounters, whether it be with people or information or situations. Look for that. I certainly believe that it gave me more opportunities it introduced me to a lot of new perspectives, and it made me a better designer. So I think that, yeah, that's the end. The three practices that work for me: stories and storytelling, conversational props, those are the cards, and the sort of organizing, making sure that you have serendipity in your life. So anyway, that's my spiel, and I'm open to questions or discussions or whatever you guys want to do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. It's awesome, actually, story, and really inspired to listen to your story about remote work. And we have some questions for you. Actually, one of these questions asked Ben about cards. This is something that needs to be made by scratch for each project, or is anything like toolkit or starter kit that can be adapted to lots of ideas and projects? What's your recommendation about that?
Yeah, it's it's a combination. Typically, they started out as particular ideas. Often they didn't even necessarily have anything to do with the project. And some of the cards were about design ideas. Some of them were about, I had for a long time a picture of an email screen that I'd stitched together. It was a manager's inbox that had 50 messages in it, and I'd highlighted the messages that were relevant to one another. And at that time, there was no way in email to sort of connect the messages to one another except with the subject line. And it was used to tell a little story about information fragmentation. And that, I was able to use that one for years because it took a long time for that problem to even begin to get addressed. So, it just varies. Typically, it either starts out because of a project or because there's an idea I'm kind of infatuated with, and I put it down in something I can show people, and then I have conversations with them. And sometimes the conversations are successful and the card kind of works and we have a good conversation. Other times they don't work so well. And so eventually the card gets discarded. It's sort of unloved and unused. And so, well, I'll throw that away or something. So yeah, so it varies. And again, it doesn't have to be cards. It could be a book of sketches. Although it's nice, again, as I said, there are things that you can just give to people. Here, this is fun. Take this as a memento or something.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, Namrata, I see that you write really great question. Maybe you would like to ask it?
Mm-hmm.
That would be
Sure.
nice.
So what is the one piece of advice about successfully working with teams, since you've done that for such a long time, and now most of the world is forced to work remotely, that you'd like to share with us tonight that you wish you had known earlier on in your career?
Okay. Well, there are two pieces of advice. You'll get two for one. One is mainly for people who are working, they're remote and the team is all together. And that's a very difficult situation to be in. This situation where everybody is remote is actually the best possible situation to be remote in because everybody's the same. But so one thing I found by virtue of being remote from the teams I worked with is that I was able to escape a lot of the crap. There's somebody's coming in for lunch and they need to be entertained, or there's a presentation, the VP wants a presentation, in 2 hours, who can do it or whatever. And if you're not there, you get to miss out on all this stuff. And on the one hand, well, yeah, there's certainly a big, that's kind of nice. But on the other hand, people recognize that. And so I always went out of my way to try to do things for people, to try to do the unexciting, unglamorous work to help other people, even though I wasn't really on the spot. And people recognize that and appreciate it. So that's the one thing. The other thing I'll tell you is at some point, so this is for the experience of, you're assigned to this team that already exists. They have a product going and you're the designer who's supposed to come in and fix stuff up. And the team already, mostly they don't think they need a designer. We're doing okay. Yeah, maybe you can make it look better, but and so a technique I hit on was I would ask them questions like, what are the needs of your users, right? And what do you think, who do you think will use this? And what problems do you think they will have? And just, the kind of questions that you would do research on. And I would often get different answers from different people. And after a while, I hit on the idea of doing a survey. And so I would put together a survey for the team that asks them, what do you think users want? What do you think the biggest problem is? These kind of things. I'd give everyone the survey, get the results back. And typically what you find is that almost no one agrees. And they don't know that they don't agree, right? And I would usually give them not only just answers, but also say, how do you think the other team members would answer, right? And so they could say, yeah, I think everybody will disagree on this one, but they rarely thought that. And so you do this survey and you say, oh, well, this is interesting. Look, you guys all have different ideas. You think you agree, but you don't. And so maybe we should talk to the users and find out what they think. And you can apply that in many different ways, right? But often teams have this illusion that they're in a lot more agreement than they think. And if you can uncover that before it comes out because suddenly there's a crisis, it's a very useful thing. And it can be funny, right? I mean, what you do is you kind of make it a game and make it fun rather than, oh, you guys are stupid, right? Or arrogant or whatever, even if they are arrogant. So that'd be my piece of advice there.
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, we had time for more questions. Thea asked a question about IBM culture. Thea, maybe you would like to introduce yourself and talk with us a bit. It would be nice.
Oh, sure. Hi, my name's thanks for speaking tonight. My name's Thea. I live in Austin, Texas, and am switching from the marketing field over to UX and product design, and have been just really interested in IBM, not only because they have a lot of UX jobs open, which is really great, but also just because it's history with innovation. But I come from the advertising industry where everyone's just like really creative. It's not super buttoned up. And in my mind, I've kind of always envisioned IBM to be maybe a little, I don't know, I picture what my dad is like, and he's a lifelong engineer. So it's very different from my background in advertising. But I was curious kind of, what was your experience like, and kind of how does it compare to what I'm envisioning? Because I imagine it's fairly creative, but there could be a lot of bureaucracy. So I'd love your take on that.
Yeah, a hard question to answer because IBM is huge, right? And different parts are different. Research is very different from other parts of the organization. So Austin, I think, is where a lot of the design people are. The person who drove that, there were a couple of people who drove that, but one of them was Charlie Hill, who's now an IBM fellow, and he was an intern in my group at Apple. He came out of the Royal College of Art, so he's a bona fide designer. And at least the last time I was sort of in touch with that part of the company, which was maybe 5 years ago, it is a place that I think designers would find very comfortable. It was very design studio-y. That said, and they've gone to a lot of work to, like, they will bring in teams to work with designers, and because they know that there's this big kind of cultural divide, right? And so they're very mindful of trying to bridge the gap. There is a degree of button downness, but I have to say, the thing I really loved about IBM, at least research, I really can't speak beyond research, but everyone is very passionate about what they do. And if you can learn enough to be able to ask questions about what they do, you'll find a lot of people just incredibly eager to talk with you. The thing I loved about IBM is I could call up anyone in research, except maybe an exec, which I didn't want to talk to execs anyway, generally. But you could call up anyone and say, "Hi, I work in this bit of IBM. Could I have half an hour of your time?" And very often, almost always, maybe I picked good people, they would say yes. You wouldn't have to explain, you wouldn't have to argue. You ask for some time and they say, a reasonable amount of time, and they say yes. And that was what was so amazing about IBM, is there's just such a huge swath of expertise that, if you screw up your courage, you can tap into it, right? And yeah, there are assholes around like there are anywhere else, and but in general, that was what was exciting about IBM. I'll tell you one other fun thing about IBM to just maybe shift your perceptions a little bit. One of the things IBM was famous for, this is not, I'm sure they don't do it anymore, but back in the sort of golden age of IBM in the 60s and 70s, people who worked in sales would come in early before their shift started, and they would all sing together. IBM actually has a songbook. You can probably find it in a web search. The first thing I did when I came to IBM was find the IBM archives and find this. And because I'd heard about the famous IBM songbook, and it's really there. All these songs, mostly praising executives, set to tunes like Jingle Bells and so on. And it's in some ways it's very bizarre, but this singing together thing, IBM was really, and I think still is, there's a really strong element of community and shared purpose in it. So, and it's also a giant bureaucracy, and there's also a lot of politics, and it's just all the crap, but there's good stuff amongst all the crap. So I think that's the best I can do.
Hey, Tia, you want to sing for the IBM then?
Is that how I have to get my job?
Yeah.
Find the songs online, I'll sing it. I'll do it.
Yeah.
That was great. Thank you so much for
Sure.
your answer. I can't wait to drop that little factoid at a party or something about the songbook.
Mhm.
Yes, awesome so much. And actually, I had also one question for you. Maybe it's the last question before we start our breakout rooms. I'm actually right now working design agency, but I have a dream to work again in the product team. And as a new designer, I will definitely curious to know, how did you select UX researchers and designers for your team when you work in Apple? Maybe you have any kind of stories and recommendations. What are the most important skills that you looked for this position?
That's a hard question. I mean, so first of all, I really enjoy doing design and studying people. And so I was never a manager. I never actually selected people myself. I just got thrown at things. That said, of course, we did interview people and bring them in, and it varies a lot, right? Sometimes there are projects that have very particular needs. And so that's kind of a no-brainer, right? You have somebody who's building some hardware, and so they need somebody with an industrial design background or whatever. But there's a saying, I don't know if everyone knows the saying or not, attributed to various people. I think it came from Alan Kay, but the saying is something like, a strong perspective is worth 40 IQ points. And so if you really look at things in a particular way and you have a perspective you can bring to bear on any problem that is kind of unique to you, that's the mark of the kind of person that I find interesting. I mean, obviously you can't be so locked into it that you can't shift other perspectives and things, but I always look for people who have strong points of view. There's another saying, this is, I forget who said this at all, strong opinions weakly held, right? So yeah, you have a strong opinion, but oh, okay, well then that doesn't work, we'll go on to something else. So I think that's the best I can do on that one.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And actually, we don't have any questions. It's a good time to start networking in our breakout rooms.
Okay.
Yeah. Melissa, do you want to?
Oh yeah, I got your message and thank you, Tom, first of all, and thank you, Daria, Namratha, and Carolina, and thank you those who are attending. Very few today: Ben, Kendall, Holly, Tia, and I think we just saw John drop. So it's kind of like a net. We are small, small number of people now. So it's not a useful to have a breakout room anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
feel free to hang around, chit chat, Tom, if you want to go. You are free to go, no obligations. And first of all, thank you so much again, coming to our, tiny meetup. It's our, just a tiny effort to bring more experts like you and give the opportunities for all stripes of designer.
Mm-hmm.
All righty. So
and actually, if I can say thank you for inviting me.
yeah, sure
I
thing.
like to, as I think my talk made clear, I like to talk to people. I like to connect. If any of you would like to shoot me an email about something, I'm happy to correspond. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Wonderful.
And, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Tom.
Okay.
So Tom, if you are available, people can chit chat with you, or they can chit chat with each other.
Yeah, I can hang out for 10 or 15 more minutes, and then I get up at 5 a.m. and I'm in Minnesota, so my bedtime is approaching. No.
All right. No, thank you. Double thank you actually. For staying up that late for us.
Tom, you mentioned people could email you. Was your email address shared anywhere? I'm not sure if I might have missed it.
It may not have been, so I will put it into the chat.
Sounds good.
And also, if you Google my name and put in Apple and IBM, because I'm old, I have an old-fashioned web page. So
yeah, and how I came to know about Tom. Basically, I was looking for the desktop metaphor kind of detail. So I stumbled upon, Tom's white paper, I guess, or some detail on his website. And it was so fascinating because that old research is still so true. And then Tom pointed me toward more, white paper. And it was fascinating to read all those details. And that's how I oh yeah, this is Tom. Basically, I was thinking about different kind of metaphor. Like we have a desktop metaphor, which trickled down onto our mobile devices as well, which is such a boring concept now. So I was thinking why don't we have a refrigerator kind of metaphor? Because the kitchen refrigerator, the family share the calendar, they share what's the grocery list and things like that. So it's evolving. The way my family is growing. So earlier it was all magnetic ABCs because my kids were 2 years old, 3 years old. Now they're grown up, so they are oh, this is my photo session at school, and my wife is oh, this is the grocery list. Modesta is hey, I have a couple of meetings, so I post them. Do not bug me because my office is in the garage. So this is the time. Don't bug me. You can knock the door or whatever. So our refrigerator is actually evolving according to the way my life is, progressing, right?
Mhm.
And if you look into our desktop on computer and, our, cell phone, right? It's static. It's not getting up to date according to my lifestyle. So that was my whole idea. That's where, I start reading your paper, basically.
Mhm. Mhm.
And to continue that thought about what you mentioned about the guild files, I feel like they have expanded largely and just moved digital. now because, now
it's
because we
bigger.
don't have limited desk space, it's unlimited cloud space. Those
Yes.
files are gigantic and they never get sorted. They
Yeah.
just
Yes,
keep
and-
growing, that's all.
And so
Yeah.
you lose that little, oh, I can sort through things and feel a bit under control, right? And so I think, if you can figure out how to give people at least a temporary feeling of getting stuff under control, I think that'd be, however you do that, whether it be through a metaphor or a tool or whatever,
Mhm.
that would be a huge thing.
Mhm. Yep.
Holly, Kendall, Ben, you guys are quiet.
No, yeah, I just wanted to chip in. This was a great talk. Thank you so much. This was my first time with this group. And
Oh, nice. Thank you.
Tom, I really appreciated what you were saying, especially about working effectively as a team member when you're remote and others aren't. I actually have been working for the same organization for about 13 years and remote for most of that. So it's been much easier in this last year when suddenly all of my colleagues are in the same place. I thought that the advice that you gave of making yourself really useful, like as somebody who, especially if you're in a different time zone than your colleagues, that they're going to be able to hand you something at the end of their workday and you'll have it done for them by the time you get in.
Yes.
That's actually, it's a really non-trivial, helpful piece of advice for anybody, just to keep yourself, like you said, in the top of the mind, even if you're not physically present the way most other people are.
Exactly. Yep.
That really connected with what my experience has been too. I appreciated that.
Hey Tom, I have a question. Thank you for this great speaker. So enthusiastic because in my last few weeks I've been researching IBM even before I went to school. And well, my question was like, how you find a mentor before working on these big companies? How you say, hey, I want to do this, how you could help me on that, or how you research them and find this would be a good pattern to follow or a good person to make questions, or you just drop questions to everyone so you could have a little piece of everyone. I'm curious about it.
Yeah, that's not, I can't really speak to the mentor question because, in part, especially in larger organizations, I would, for most of my career, I was plugged into larger organizations. And so to a degree that was built in. And I mean, there were special efforts made for, like at IBM, women who were, I think, 1 in like 10 when I joined. And I'm a white male guy. And so, yeah. I guess I guess what I always did was I would watch, and this is kind of a repetition of the last point, but I would look for people who were really different from me, but who we had some kind of connection. Maybe we just thought each other was weird, or we each knew something that the other wanted to, even though, if you drew, overlapping diagrams, there'd just be a tiny overlap. But I find those kind of things really stimulating. I mean, in some sense, I didn't really need mentorship. I think you need a lot of mentorship if you're trying to become a manager and you have to deal with the organizational politics and know who is who and know how to resolve certain situations. And I never liked that at all. And so much of my career, I found ways to work for somebody who was a strong manager. Most of the time, a woman, as it turned out, although not always, who would sort of protect me from that stuff and let me do what I was good at and loved, and we sort of would have a mutual sort of supportive relationship. And to go back to the dues thing, if I knew my manager was, had a big presentation tomorrow, I would offer to proof slides, or she was trying to finish a paper, I'd offer to proofread it, just, anything to say, I'm here, I'm on your side, just the way that you are on my side for me. So, yeah. So I don't really know how to tell you how to go about getting a mentor, except to say that often people are a lot more willing to mentor you than you might expect. People enjoy sharing what they know, right? And the main, especially if you can come and say, here's what I'm struggling with, and here's what I'd like to learn, and I think you can teach me that, would you? And if you can't, can you direct me to somebody else, right? Because always ask people to direct you to other people. That's
exactly. I second that. And also I can add one more thing about how to find the mentor. So I'm a person of color, right? And I have an accent. English is my third language, not the second language. I speak 4 languages basically. So when I was transitioning from the development, I was a software developer, software architect, and then I end up, working as a software manager. And that's when I started transitioning into the UX designer. So I basically shouted out loud on the Twitter or on someone's blog post, where after hearing from Jared Spool, he said, I think somewhere back in 2008 or somewhere around that we need 10,000 UX designers in next couple of years. And I did complain to, during on that blog that, hey, actually, nobody's helping me out. I'm a developer, and, there's always a rift between a UX designer and a developer. So who gonna help me out and what have you? So one person reached out to me via Twitter, and I end up, she helped me out, and she taught me a couple of things, like what kind of trend I need to keep looking toward right now. One was responsive design back in 2008. Imagine that, like focus on the mobile app and also the responsive design app for the web. It's going to be a huge thing. And I said, all right, because she says iPhone, just introduced, it's just been 1 year. Android is coming in 2008. So after, she revealed her name, and she used to work for Nielsen Norman Group for 12 years. She was a user, Susan Farrell. And that was like, turning point, basically. What she taught me, which made me what I am today, so if you want to look for a mentor, make sure somebody who is, has 10 plus years of experience, can show you the trend, not the current thing that what you're doing, because current tool and details, we all know, we all have access to Medium and all these kind of details. You can go and learn tutorial immediately, like 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours max, right? But somebody teach you about the future trend, where the puck gonna be, right? I skate where the puck gonna be, right? Not where it is right now. So that kind of mindset, if you find somebody like this, go for it, and yes, as Tom says, keep asking, because when you ask, you will get the, somebody gonna connect you with someone.
And just to emphasize this, it works both directions, right? When you mentor somebody, when you work with somebody younger, the older person, at least if they're any good, they typically learn stuff too, right? Maybe not the same kind of stuff you're learning, but you see, oh, I've worked with these 3 young designers, and they're all talking about this, or they all, none of them use email anymore. They use other things to communicate, or whatever. It's, it's a way of staying in touch with sort of, people who are growing up in a different generation, who have different experiences and different norms and different expectations. And that's something, as you start getting senior, you can get cut off from.
Yeah.
Maybe if you have a bunch of, kids who are growing up, they'll make
Yeah.
fun of you and keep you current. But anyway, mentorship is even if it's not talked about that way, people will get value out of helping you. And so just you're not approaching them just as someone asking for something free that you're not giving anything back, because you are giving stuff back.
True.
I have two more questions. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Carolina. Carolina, go ahead.
One is like, from where you have inspiration as a designer, and the second one is like, when you put an end or a stop or a dot when you are a researcher to your curiosity. I mean, because curiosity never ends. So how you stop sometimes and say, hey, this is enough. I'm not going to make more because I'm wasting my time or something like that.
For me, inspiration. So I've always just been fascinated by particular details, by examples. And what I'm most interested, so most of my design work has, the last 20 years anyway, has been on how people interact in online systems. And what I do is I look at how people interact in real life, right? And what makes those interactions work well. And it's not just maybe people talking directly with one another, it's noticing things like, people will use various signals like leaving their office door open or closed if they want to be interrupted or not, or the way people will choose to communicate, putting stuff on the refrigerator, right? Just noticing little things in the real world, especially if you see them again and again. And often what I do is I collect lots of examples of stuff. I just think, oh, that's interesting. I'll take a picture of it. And then pretty soon I've got this big thing of pictures that I look through, and sometimes something comes out of them and sometimes it doesn't. So that was one. The other question was, how do you know when does your curiosity stop? And, clearly the answer is never, but for practical purposes, the organization keeps moving on, right? They don't want you doing the same thing forever. A project comes to an end, and even if you're still interested in it, well, I have spent a certain amount of time working on projects I wasn't supposed to, where I wasn't getting paid to work on, but finding time to do it just because I was curious or interested, and that's fine. But mostly the organization keeps you moving along and gives you a structure, and that's not a bad thing, right? You can get too curious about something and get stuck in it, and it can be really good to be taken away from something, and then, a few years later, if you're still curious about it, come back to it, and a lot of stuff, you see it from a different perspective. So,
wonderful, awesome. Any last more comments or anything from anyone of you?
I was going to add something quick to the discussion about mentorship, just quickly, that if you do find someone like that maybe is already in your personal network that seems to be willing to invest some time and energy in you, consider them even if they're outside of your industry or your track of interest. I was in a mentorship group where I was paired with someone, and one of the people was in marketing like me. And so I went in thinking like, oh, we're really going to hit it off. I'm going to get so much value from her. And it ended up actually being the person who was like mid-70s, and she was a lawyer for an aerospace company. And it was partially her personality, but also just because she, kind of speaking to that strength of weak ties discussion earlier, it's like this was a person completely outside of my realm of influence and interest. Like, I'm not really interested in aerospace law, but she had some really good stories and ended up being a great connection and friend, as well as a mentor. So yeah, keeping an open mind as well, because obviously this product, all the sources that were shared in chat are really great for those specific insights that can propel you, but some of these other things are just so human Like a lot of the things Tom said, like storytelling, that is universal across every industry, and you just pull those nuggets. So that's just my take on it.
No,
Yeah,
thank you.
no,
This is
great
Yep.
point.
superb point.
Thank you.
Cool. All righty. So
Okay.
thank you everyone, and have a superb night. And I hope to see you again next month. And once again, Tom, thank you for staying late for us.
Sure
and
thing.
bestowing us with your presence.
It
This was great. Thank you guys very much.
was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Good night.
Good night.
Great.